Anyway, we're making a taco about the whole thing to you. And remember, we're not being polite about this stuff. This is dead set. This is the line in the sand. This is dead set. This is the line in the sand, right? It really is a line in the sand, and you should have heard the speaker.
I'd come back with a question.
You're challenging agriculture, you're challenging government, you're challenging government departments and practices, global practices. Everyone's just like banks and sort of whatever. Four of us. And we're going to 4 o'clock. Okay, cool.
Even if we're illegal. But to apologise to anyone who feels inconvenienced, otherwise sit back, relax, and sit to the beautiful tunes. Choo. We'll just pretend we're a bus of folks who don't speak English. Then we won't have to get be cranky at us.
Okay.
It's on. That's a bit like the ABC kind of thing at the end of the day. What do you call that? Yeah, remember the old coloured stripe? Doesn't have any more steam left turns off the test pad. This is the tribunal test pad. That's
Colour
what
bar.
we can see. Welcome. We're going to start again in a few minutes. All this way down from the start. I mean,
James, you ordered cappuccino with sugar.
Oh, that's mine.
Cappuccino with sugar. Did you do one?
Dos. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I have yeah, weird. What is that one? Wait, because I don't get my. Well, pretty good anyway. No, it's good. Yeah, that's right.
How long until we can kick off Saturday? We're ready to go. Excellent. Why don't you just go outside and see if there's anyone else who can ask them to come in, and then we'll Okay. Are all our wonderful technical folks ready? Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's come back. I suspect there was a bit of a queue for refreshments, so folks can come and go as they please. I'm now very pleased to invite Isaac Beale to manage our speakers for our first case study, the impacts of agriculture in the Brigalow Belt bioregion. We have a mix of people who are able to be here today and a couple of folks by technology. We will work that out. So over to you, Isaac. Thank you so much.
So, to begin our case on the impacts of agriculture in the Brigalow Belt bioregion, initially we'd like to call Warren Saunders, please.
Thank you again. Did any new people come to the meeting? Did new people, everyone the same thing this morning?
You can introduce yourself.
Isaac will ask you to introduce yourself again, Warren.
Yeah, if you were happy to introduce yourself again, that would be great.
Just a short version is fine too.
Warren Ganser of Saunders, and I'm a Gungari man from the Marinara River, born at Mitchell, and grew up in Roma and Toowoomba. And I've always been bushwalker and used to go shooting, yabbing and things when we were kids and riding around, and just anything to get out in the bush. And and then I'm going to move to Canberra, join the army. I think I told her I got paid for crawling around the bush, getting yelled at, but the army was pretty good, taught you how to get up when you got kicked down. And then I've been in the Environment Department. I had been a landscaper, I'm a native plant bush tucker sort of expert, and track down plants, covered dirt, wherever it might be. But I've done a lot of agricultural projects, agroforestry work, saltbush crops. We get seed together, kangaroo grass and microlina and wallaby grass, put into pasture mixes. We do tree belts on properties, driveways, and a lot of wetlands too. There's tailings dams around dumps and councils, and then we're also doing a lot of work in subdivisions. And these days the subdivisions tend to get their trendy wetland, which we did a lot of work for. So at the bottom of the new developments these days have a trendy wetland down there, and we do a lot of planting in those. And then dogs can run in there, but it catches all the effluent that comes off the suburb. And we've got a lot of, in Canberra, we've got a lot of support there because it's taken a while to get the council to do it, but property owners and developers found that a wetland nearby actually put property prices up, and we got a lot of support from the Adelaide Council and the Albury Council because they have to clean all the salt out of the water coming down the river. Canberra's the biggest polluter, the Murray-Darling of the Murray River. Probably a bit more polluters up the stream as well, but yeah, it's a big polluter, and so that saved them millions of dollars once we put these wetlands in, so that they'll clean up all that effluent. But we're going to talk about the Brigalow Belt, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you the initial question, if that's all right. This morning, focusing on the Brigalow Belt by origin, and I just want to ask you how, in your opinion, European colonisation and industrial agriculture has affected access to country and communities and First Nations cultural practices.
For sure. Well, I'd like to just say a bit first about, we've got our maps up there. Okay. It's me in the nursery. Yeah, okay. The Ngungri people have lived on the Marinara region and its tributaries for a very long time. It's in the central Queensland. I don't know if you know the Marinara River, but up the top is sort of Carnarvon Gorge, and the river goes quite straight down to St George. And it's quite an unusual river because it's almost a river that there's so much sand that it's eroded, it's created its own banks. So the river goes quite straight, it goes down a ridge. The river is that big. And so as it goes down, it's shifted a lot of sand and soil, and that's changed the topography of the district. We are a bit further west out there, so it's getting onto a semi-arid desert sort of country, so we don't get quite the weed issues. A lot of weeds out there, they get into disturbed areas. Weeds and ferals are very much a sign of human activity, roads and digging things up, because when you get into the solid hard bush, it's very hard for exotic things to grow in there. They will get in there, but the Australian climate and the soil starts to sort it out, and even the animals. We've got a lot of eagles out there that eat the rabbits and the foxes and the cats. But further towards the coast, they probably get a bit more of a comfortable lifestyle. Mind you, we've still got problems out there. There's camels and prickly pears, and there's all enough weeds out there in buffel grass, although they buy buffel grass. Oh boy. So the river's a bit unusual in itself. And our people have been living a semi-nomadic lifestyle there, moving from seasonal food and water to the next. And we had large permanent camps around our districts, along the rivers, near water sources and billabongs. And they're often about a day's walk apart, so you can move up to the next billabong and that. We've got a songline through a trade route, songline through our district that goes up through the river. So if you want to get across Australia, you've got to get onto the song line, like highways, and travel through it. And our district, at the top of it is Carnarvon Gorge. And if you look at your maps, Google Earth is fantastic. If you look at Carnarvon Gorge, it's almost been referred to as a roof of Australia, or the top, because it's not as high as Kosciuszko, but from that bit of land up in Carnarvon Gorge, big rivers come off it. So the top of our country, we're the top of the Murray-Darling Basin, but once you go over the hill, the river is Belliando or something, goes up to Townsville. So Burdekin, the Fitzroy catchments, big catchments come off the other side of Carnarvon Gorge, and then out to the end of it, the water goes out to Cooper's Creek and Lake Eyre and into the Peru catchment. So that little strip of country on the Carnarvon Gorge, it's on the Great Dividing Range, waters from there spread all across the country. And so in the old days you'd have to come up there, do a special ceremony or get permission, depending on your business, and for you to pass over to go somewhere. So you've got to marry outside your tribe. You've got to move around. So we had a lot of trade, and people went through our district quite a bit. And today, many of us still live and regularly visit our home country, and our family ties are very strong. We do have a modern lifestyle now. We're not as dark as we used to be, and we've got jobs and modern people. But we do have connection to country, and it's been especially so since we had successful land title claims, the Goongarees. We've had the second biggest claim, so that's done a stack for the district. And we've got strong committees who organise activities and strong advocates in the city who represent us. So our tribe's been done quite well, I think. We've kept quite strong through connection to land and country. Now, we've got I've got a lot of good photos of good country and bad up here. So I'll go back to the start of it. This is a nice country up at Carnarvon Gorge. It's all national park and had some livestock in there and burning and that. There's been a lot more burning since Europeans have turned up. You might not think so, but overall, much more burning. This is one of our big camps, was at the Three Rivers Junction, Amby Creek, Womalilla Creek and the Marinale River, and they all join within 100 metres of each other. So it's very rare geologically to get three rivers on flat country meet up at the one spot. It's a really unusual place. Mind you, look at all the sand being brought down. In the old days we've been rockier. There's always been sand along the river, but there's a lot more rockier and big billabongs, and a lot of this agriculture has filled up the river. So much sand, all the billabongs, they're not as deep, they're filled in. There are big billabongs off to the side of this though, because the Womalilla and the Amby Creek are a bit more natural and come out a bit more clay country, less than sand. So they're beautiful big permanent billabongs on both sides of there. You can see the creek, Womalilla is on the left there coming in. It's an unusual catchment. Now, with our land use, we're always centred around water. So we've got a drink, got a wash, but water always has lots of food sources, fish, eggs and birds and things of plants I mentioned before. And modern agriculture likes that water. A lot of water gets taken out of this river. Further down is Cubby Station, it's a massive place, doing cotton and rice and things. So a lot of water is taken out. And modern agriculture and industry uses a stack of water, more than what you're ever going to drink. So there's a big impact on the water resources. Could go to the next picture, I think. Oh, here we are, looking at some scar trees here. A lot of the agriculture that our tribe had was to do with the land. We've got seasonal things to do. We walk from resources to the next. We protect things into the future, and we didn't really dig things up because there wasn't the requirement to make mega bucks. What was all that money going to do you? I think that way a bit these days even. Doesn't always bring you that much happiness. So, our community is strong, all those sort of things we enjoy about being together. This is up at the top of the catchment. Keep going, because these are all sort of natural areas that are taken. There's some cattle there in the park. And natural country is pretty easy to walk through. It's got patches through it, it's got a crossword, it's got a mosaic, it's got bands through it. It's not monocultures, it's just the one thing. And when you look at them on the maps, you can't see that same structure, except lots of squares or circles. Keep going, the fire. We've got a little movie of the fire, might work. So fire's a big part of the district because things burn. Now this fire was lit accidentally, someone was burning their toilet paper. Not me. But it sort of took off quite tamely. It didn't take it too long really, but it's quite natural for the fire to burn through the district. Brigalow country, there's loves going up, and you only got to put a flame down and you got to put it out. Poof, it just keeps spreading. So when it gets dry up there, it's very hard to control. And when it gets wet, oh, it's so much water. The grass is so tall, so you can get out there and just see green countryside going for miles, like English countryside. And then other times it all goes grey and starts turning to dirt. So the country can change quite quickly. This sort of rocky country. I think a lot of goats have gotten into this area. It's all stony. I think there's a few rabbits were up in amongst that. But the plant there I took the photo of is a cancer curing bush that our tribe uses and other tribes called maroon bush. It's a bit hard to find, but I eat a leaf day if I can. And it has got quite amazing powers. It was used by the Western Australian Department of Health years ago for cancer patients. But unfortunately it got taken away because it might have been too good. So there's a bit of an attack on indigenous sort of remedies and that sort of thing. So hopefully, we're hoping that's one of the plants that we'd like to see get out there eventually. Scabola spinescens. Got a nice little berry on it too that you can eat. So there's a lot of very good plants that are out there, just get quite forgotten about. These are some of the soaks that are around our district. They're just in the middle of the bush. You find these little springs come up. But this one's got a very important plant called old man weed. It's Centipeta, Cunningham. And it's now used for a lot of skin preparations. It was a bit of a cure-all for us. You just crush it up, it's got thymol in it. But these days the Chinese are putting it into a lot of skin preparations. And I think Australia too gets skin preparations from old man weed. It works quite well. Got a lot of uses. This is just some area along the river. Got a lot of old trees. These trees are all keeping the water table down. The farmers, good farmers, do want their trees on their property. You need shade for your stock. That's a bit of a cool burn up at Mount Moffat. And we've got here permanent billabong. This is a naturally, shame it's not such a good, can't see it so well, but there's some beautiful billabongs, permanent things, and a lot of the old properties are based around these billabongs because they didn't really run out of water. But unfortunately, modern agriculture, the water's browner. This creek wasn't too bad. This is Nabeen Creek, which is to the west of Maranoa River, but it's still got water going through it. It's a bit cleaner, but it's dirty still because of agriculture and stock getting down to it. So that was a bit of the history of our country as well. When the first people that turned up there were drovers, and they just took off in the bush and off they went with their big herds of stock. And they weren't too bad because we traded with them, and they tended to, there's only one of them, they weren't very powerful, so they tended to do what they were told when they turned up. But they did cause issue by fouling up billabongs. We didn't mind eating their cattle and sheep either. But they did start fouling up the billabongs and water resources, and there were a few conflicts there because they'd turn up to your billabong and run the cows through it. They're also quite interested in our women. And a lot of social problems were started up when they first came along. And they brought diseases with them and different attitudes. But then after that, there was large partial leases were sold off in England and Sydney and Brisbane. So the land got cut up, but it was sold off-site. So then all the partialists turned up and, where's my property? And we've got blackfellas here and Irish drovers, we don't want that. So they started putting up the fences, cutting down the trees, and there was probably a 10 or 12 year war between the settlers and more so the mobs nearest, the Manandangi, Cooma, Bidjara, Yiman and others. We sort of stayed a bit away from it, but we were part of the fighters who were fighting even further down at Moree and places like that. And they might come back to our country and regroup. So there's quite a bit of a war going on. We had white people on our side as well. But our mob did turn up to some places and kill all the blackfellas as well. So the line started to get blurred. And once the war finally picked up to us, we sort of went to work. The old days were well and truly over by about the 1870s, and the modern world turned up. So, but we try and stay in our own area, but a lot of our people still there and their descendants still there caring and looking after the country. Also, as the time went by, forestry and mining started up. More so these days, in the 20th century. They've got cypress, timber and hardwoods as well. And a lot of railway sleepers were built from the hardwoods out there, poplar box and ironbark, and they wanted the cypress pine because termites don't eat cypress pine, so a lot of houses in Queensland around the place have got cypress pine. So forestry, but it's not quite the impact compared to agriculture. And there's also mining, a lot of gas mining now, and there's coal and things like that, and petrol, oil, whatever. So that's mostly it. And some gemstones as well, but they're not quite the big impact as agriculture. And with modern equipment and chemicals, cropping began. Large scale wheat, corn and barley and other grains, and that's when the system was cultivated and put down fertiliser and stuff. And I was studying at Gatton Ag College for a year, just turned up to learn stuff, whatever lecture I wanted to go to. And one of the lecturers did tell us one day, the soil is just there to make plants stand up, everything else we can do. Well, yeah, for a while until the dirt starts to turn to acid or something else, and then what are you going to do then? Well, go to hydroponics or something, aquaponics. So it's a big waste of resources, really. So much has been wasted in this country. And for a fellow like me, when I walk around, I just see stuff in the bush. I'm a seed collector, so when I look at a gum tree, I can see 2 or 3 grand worth of seed on that tree. Whereas the farmer, they're going to chop that down to set up $10 worth of wheat. So I had been on property once, and there's all this kangaroo grass, which we sell really young for $500, $600 a kilo. And he was going to cut all that, and said, "Oh, can we get that?" He said, yeah, but I'm going to knock all that down next year to put in some barley for something. So he's about to get rid of, we're looking at a big $300,000 of kangaroo grass out there. And he was about to get rid of it for some bodgy crop at Cooma, at Breadboat. So we tried to get in his ear. So yeah, there's a fair bit of money in native crops, and that's something that I've very much been interested in. Bush foods, salt bushes, and there are big crops out there, macadamias, tea tree oil, and there are other ones out there, Australian products, especially fish, prawns, barramundi, that's all bush stuff, and oysters. And there's some pretty big industries that are based around Australian food. Look at a couple more photos. Regrowth of this property down there where my great-great-grandfather had, Woodland Station, getting towards St George. Here's a fouled up billabong, that's on the property. They've got a pretty good property. They're sort of family-owned properties. A big difference. Most farmers I come across, we do a lot of work with them, and they're very keen on looking after their properties. They're moving over to holistic farming and permacultural ideas and crop rotations and all these sort of things, if they can get themselves organised enough to do it. But the corporate farms are run by stock exchanges and the futures people. So I went to a property at Temora, and there's a beautiful old house homestead there, and the inside are a bunch of lads in their 20s, some less than that. The room's covered in tins and Bundy rum bottles, and they just get rung up to go out and put in a crop or something. And their cropping is determined by stock exchange and futures people that they were tied in with. So they said, they put in wheat, and they said, it's the dumbest idea going, but the bosses have told us to put it in because statistically they're putting crops in Argentina, Australia, all around the world, and they're gambling on all these crops. And as a package, something's going to come out of this. And so it's very much cropping done by stock exchange sort of stuff. And I think that's a big part of the issue. They've got the money just to clear it like nothing else. Where smaller farmers aren't quite geared up, they're working with the land and trying to use their native plants. And in our district, a lot of the properties do run on native pasture and stuff because it's more arid in our area. It's pretty hard to rely on water to get a decent crop going. There's not many wheat fields out there. There's some cotton. Cotton's a bit tougher. But there's big paddocks for feed like milo and other things. Got some other photos. Here's a river. Yeah, that's all the effect of agriculture. All the river's been choked up with sand, so it's harder to get the water. So that's hard for the property owners. They've got to sink bores now to get out the water. this is overgrazing, not such a good picture, but yeah, once it really starts to get smashed like that, nothing will grow on it. So if you put the stock in, and here's the one, this is probably the worst one I found, at Nabeen Creek. This area is it's a reserve. There's lots of camping reserves in Queensland, and a lot of the camping reserves are on old stock routes, and a lot of them are based on old tribes' camps. So a lot of these camping reserves around our tribes' camps are around the billabongs. And you can see on the maps of all these camping reserves about a day's walk apart, often where we were, because there were tracks going there too. So the early settlers just decided to make these camping grounds. But what happens to these camps is everyone thinks they own them out there. So everyone just puts a stop through it. So you just cut a hole in the fence and, oh, whoopsie, my stock went through the other side. Oh, sorry mate, I'll come over and get it. So there's a lot of lost paddocks, absentee landholders. There's paddocks out there owned by, Barron somebody from somewhere who hasn't been there for 40 years. And so we just cuts the fence and let them go through there. And same as Crown land in places. So there's a lot of dodgy stuff goes on at times, with moving fences around and cutting holes through things, and so they're quite an opposition side of properties are very nervous about each other. The other one is goats. Goats weren't worth money, but now goats you can get $15 for or something. So one of the properties I was at had the goats were running around. He was worried about the neighbours cutting the fence to steal his feral goats. So he was encouraging feral goats because he had 5,000 of them up there, and that was 5,000. That was 70,000 bucks he was going to get, and he was very nervous about me being there and telling anybody about his goats. So you get different property owners, I must say. Loss of biodiversity, soil erosion, salinity. I think other speakers have spoken a bit about it. I've got to wind up now, don't I? Okay. That's the worst.
That's awesome, Warren. Thank
That's
you.
up there, that picture.
Thank you very much, Warren. Is there any questions from the panel?
Thank you, Warren. That was a really excellent overview of both life before and after some of the grazing came in. Can you just let us know a little bit more? You said that the rivers are now filled in and they're not as deep as they used to be. And I've heard other people say that the water wasn't always brown, but my generation or many others perhaps, all we ever see when we go bush, the creeks we love, they're brown. What is that from cattle and stock coming down? That's what I hear.
Well, it's a bit natural in places, but when the water starts getting salty, it starts to suspend solids. You get sodic soils. So as soil gets salty, especially a place like Wagga, the ground has become saltier because of all this agriculture. The salt's always been there as well, but the agriculture brought the water tables up. And once soil becomes sodic, it becomes a melty soil. So you get a bit of clod, you put it in water, and it splays apart, and you've got sodic soil, and so it suspends particles, the saltiness. So that's why a lot of them have got that brownness about them. It is a little bit natural, but in the old days it would have been more black water from all the tea tree. So when you find natural good creeks, you do find them out there, there's this black looking water. And that's a good sign. So the brown stuff is not natural, no. And once upon a time, because even some of my great uncles told me about when the Marinara River had deep billabongs, clean water flowing over rocks. And that it's only been, 60 years, 70 years. And that really came about once the big croppers turned up. Because then they just, big ploughs and D9s going across big sections of country. And that was the start of probably the 40s and 50s after the Second World War.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Warren.
Thank you.
Next, can we please call Larson Taylor? Thank you. Hi, Martin. Initially, can we please just ask you for your qualifications and where you're from?
I'm from Brisbane. I'm a conservation scientist at Griffith University Environmental Studies and a PhD in ecology.
Thank you. So if you wouldn't mind, can you please tell us how livestock production has affected the Brigalow Belt, and then perhaps discuss some of the solutions to some of these problems?
Yes, thank you. And it was great to hear Warren's lead in because it was perfectly matched. And in fact, I know a lot of that country. My nana was born in Rocky Bank, south of Mitchell, and on a station in the late 1890s, believe it or not. So that country is reasonably familiar to me as well. But look, next slide please. I just want to run down a few things. The Brigalow Belt itself, a bit of the ecological history, livestock impacts, the 5 big types of livestock impacts, what that does to us, nature bites back. And the terrible part of the story is that how most of this can be avoided and still have livestock production, but also at the end alternative. Next slide please. So here's the town of Brigalow. The Brigalow Belt is that shown on the map at the right there. It's a large swathe going from Townsville all the way down to Gundawindi. It's the largest of the 13 bioregions in Queensland. You've got subhumid, semi-arid, dense forests and grassy woodlands, as Warren said, these bands, strips. It's not homogeneous at all. And of course, it's named after the signature tree with the wall with the silvery leaves called Acacia harpyphila. Next slide, please. Brigalow forests have been cleared below 8% of their original extent, and so that is blank spots on the map, the white spots where Brigalow used to be, and the black spots are where they're left. And so there's only one big patch. You can see the big patch just southwest of Emerald is Castle Vale. It's actually a nature refuge. But right next to it, to the east of that, is one of the biggest clearing events in the history of Queensland, of Manchurian Downs, which is just north of Carnarvon National Park. Of course, all of this clearing pretty much to over 90% for livestock pasture, which includes not just simply taking away the trees, but actually blade ploughing and putting in exotic pastures, exotic species of pasture. And Brigalow now is an endangered ecological community. Next slide, please. So let's look at the first impact, which is grazing itself. You get the removal of food, so this should be an obvious one. The cows are competing with native wildlife for food. So here's just one example of many. The black-throated finch in the northern, and there's a map underneath the finch of where it occurs. In the northern Brigalow Belt, desert uplands and Aussie uplands. It's an endangered bird now, and grass seed sources are eaten by cattle. And the important thing is the vast scale which this happens, of course. The cattle are on the landscape at a vast scale. So 60% of the state of Queensland has got livestock. Okay, next one. The next effect of grazing is the removal of cover, leading to increased exposure and predation of native wildlife. Right? And that should be another obvious thing too. Take away the grass cover, the ground cover. The animals that live there can no longer hide from predators. And just below that, as an example, you see that progression of columns going up. Well, that's the numbers of species of mammals in those different environments. When it was stopped with livestock, 1 year after, 2 year after, and 3 year after removal of livestock, a meteoric increase in the mammal species richness just by taking away livestock, right? And that just shows you how powerful this impact is of livestock on removal of cover. Next slide, please. The other thing that the hoof of the cow does is, as well as removing the ground cover, they're also breaking up the soil surface and compacting it. So if we go to the next slide, that means that you get less rainfall infiltrating through the soil and more runoff on the soil. Okay, and that's the next slide shows you. Well, we've seen an example of that having increased erosion. Next slide, and that leads to sediment pollution. And of course, sediment pollution, next slide, leads to marine impacts. So not just the freshwater communities suffer in those streams themselves, but also this gets washed out onto the Great Barrier Reef, where it's a major cause of biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. Now probably the biggest impact of livestock production is it's the main driver of tree clearing in Queensland. Next slide, please. So this is the graph showing how the areas of land cleared in Queensland, and you'll see that U-shaped pattern. That's because there was a ban on broad-scale clearing came into play in 2006, It was going gangbusters until the government fell in 2012 and took the axe, in their own words, to the land clearing laws in Queensland. Those two colours, the top colour is regrowth, so that's stuff that could be knee-high, but it could also be as high as, up there. It depends how old it is, but it's called regrowth. And the denser colour is remnant. It's never been cleared before, it's mature forest, right? Next slide. And so just looking at the mature forest that's been bulldozed, the rate of bulldozing of mature forest has increased 5 times in as many years, 5 times in 5 years, as a result of the Newman government taking the axe to the land clearing laws. But Rebel Point, of course, Rio is going to tell us a lot more about that later. Next slide, please. So the equivalent, let's just imagine this: if you've got 465 D9 bulldozers, about 5 metres wide in the blade, clearing a 2.3 kilometre wide strip from Brisbane to Cairns in just 1 year, that's how much is cleared. Okay, so you get a sense of just how vast this activity is in Queensland's landscape. Thank you. Next slide. Most clearing is in the Brigalow Belt and in the Mulga lands. So just south of the Brigalow Belt there, south and west, is the Mulga lands, and those are the two big hotspots of land clearing in Queensland: Brigalow Belt and Mulga lands. Next slide, please. Over 90% of clearing in Queensland is for pasture or for livestock feed crops like sorghum, lucerne, and so forth. Next slide, please. Most of the tree clearing that happens, I don't think I can play that video, but there's no permit needed, no fauna, or has happened, no fauna survey or relocation is required. The only requirement is to give notice and follow a very lax clearing code, so it's essentially exempt under Queensland law. Let's look at federal law. There's no compliance with federal law. We've just discovered that 300,000 hectares of threatened species habitats bulldozed in Queensland in the last 3 years, not a single referral for approval under the Commonwealth legislation. And to make things worse, the Commonwealth don't enforce it. They take no action. Right? Codes and laws were tightened in by the Queensland Government in May of this year, but it remains to be seen what the impact of that is. Next slide, please. Let's look at some of the impacts of tree clearing. We obviously have the direct killing of wildlife. When bulldozers go through, it's killing animals. You get destruction of habitat, and that leads to death. So you might die at site, but then you've got to know where to go, or where you go is already occupied, so you end up fighting with existing wildlife, and so you die. So we estimate 45 million mammals, birds and reptiles killed in just 1 year, for which we have data in Queensland. And on top of that, you get the fragmentation of habitat that results, so the breaking up of the forest into patches. And because of that breaking up, you have ongoing higher mortality of the animals that remain there in those remnants. Right? They have higher mortality levels. And so that's why we get native species going towards extinction. That's two effects: losing habitat, but also the habitat that's left is broken up. Next slide, please. And so we see, just in the State of the Environment report that came out for 2016, clearing and land use change is ranked by Australian ecologists as the #1 threat to our native wildlife. Climate change is coming in at #2, invasive species and pathogens #3. Thank you. Next slide. Koalas, just think about koalas. Most people think that the problem with koalas in southeast Queensland, and certainly the ag lobby like you think that it's in southeast Queensland, but when we did the numbers, we found that that's only a drop in the ocean of what's happening in Queensland, because if you look at the rest of the state, koalas don't just occur in southeast Queensland. Koalas have always been widespread in the state. They go all the way out to Charleville, all the way up to Townsville. And when you look at the numbers dying, which are estimates, I admit, but they've been accelerating too, and most of those deaths of koalas are not in southeast Queensland, they're out in Brigalow Belt. Next slide, please. And let's think of what that means. This amounts to persecution of animals on a mass scale. So, we don't just get the death of animals, we get tremendous suffering of animals. And Scott, I believe, is going to be talking about welfare impacts of production later, but this is probably the biggest crisis of animal welfare. And certainly the RSPCA agrees with me on this, that all these animals are unseen. We don't know, we don't see them. It's not like an urban area where you get bush knocked over and you see the koalas running across the road and getting knocked by a car. Out in the Brigalow Belt, nobody's seeing this, right? So it's invisible, it's hidden. But there's a huge animal welfare crisis, animals suffering and dying because of the destruction of and fragmentation of the habitat. Next slide, please. Here's something that's what we call directed. So that's undirected persecution. When you're knocking the forest down, your intention is to knock down the forest, not actually kill the animal. That's a side product. But of course, there's a lot of direct persecution by the livestock industry, particularly of dingoes. Countless dingoes are trapped, shot and poisoned just because they might attack stock, and there's a picture which is all too common in western districts of dingoes strung up on a fence. That's kind of medieval, like putting heads on a pike or whatever. Next slide, please. Kangaroos are slaughtered en masse because they compete with stock for forage. And this doesn't include those that are actually harvested for meat. So there's a section of kangaroos which are harvested for meat. This is just damage mitigation permits. By grazies, it's just to shoot kangaroos to get rid of it, right? And so hundreds of thousands of permits issued in the non-commercial take in Queensland. Next slide, please. The persecution of dingoes has profound conservation impacts because they're top of the food chain. And the removal of top predators is linked throughout the world, not just here, throughout the world is linked to the extinction of small mammals because of dingo persecution. Because it releases these exotic, what are called mesopredators, middle-level predators from control, and they decimate the smaller native wildlife. Next slide, please. Fencing has tremendous conservation impacts that are very little understood and very little studied. In fact, this study is back in 1999 as the last study I could find. Barbed wire and traps, gliders, bats, wading birds, night birds and birds of prey, and of course these ubiquitous in grazing country. Next slide, please. Fencing also impedes migration and escape from predation and causes starvation. So it's also a form of non-directed persecution of animals. And here's an amazing shot of emus out in Western Australia coming up against the rabbit-proof fence and trying to get through during a drought. Thank you. Next slide. Water points. This is so Warren talked about some of those goats. Those are goat tracks next to a camping reserve. So again, we're a camping reserve with a tank out near Kurrawingi National Park. And that's a perfect example of the fact that, if you put water where water never was, in the arid zone particularly, in the Simpson Desert, it has a lot of problems. It attracts alien species, horses, foxes and weeds. They can live there where previously they wouldn't have been able to live. And that decimates arid zone fauna that aren't used to having those animals around. So bilbies, for example, the late Peter McRae, the late lamented Peter McRae found that bilbies disappeared whenever a stock boar went in. So the bilby populations were healthy until the stock boar went in, and then suddenly the bilbies disappeared. So water points. Next slide, please. Greenhouse pollution. Livestock methane equals 10% of national emissions. So that's just from the cow, just from their rumen, from the digestion. And that may be higher than they think, but recent research. And tree clearing is about 7%. So just the emissions from the livestock exceed the emissions from tree clearing. Both have been underestimated. Let's keep going. Next slide. And of course, this causes global climate change, which is linked to more severe droughts. Next slide. But also you get local climate warming and drying because of the loss of tree cover. This is a well-known geophysical effect of losing tree cover. And here's a should be a well-known farmer called Glenn Morris in Inverell saying, we are destroying this water cycle through widespread land clearing, particularly in Queensland. We need to start revegetation big time. Trees keep the landscape cool and wild, which encourages local rainfall. Physicists couldn't have put it better than a local farmer. Thank you. Next slide. So let's talk about minimising. This is a disgraceful thing. All of these impacts can be minimised. Let's go on. Next slide. Next slide. Tree clearing. Cattle can be and are run successfully in intact woodlands and forests. Right? So that's the first thing. The amazing thing about livestock is you really don't need to cut down the trees to have a viable livestock operation. Right? Livestock, that's the whole point of livestock. They can be run in a natural landscape. And of course we have big retailers like Macca's now demanding deforestation-free production. Thank you. Next slide. Grazing and trampling, the solutions are very well studied and it's not rocket science. Just reduce your stocking rates, rest the paddocks and fence off riparian or other sensitive areas. Next slide, please. Livestock can be protected non-lethally with guardian animals. There's a lot of research on this now, particularly Rammies, guardian dogs. So dingoes don't really need to be persecuted. In fact, a lot of research is now showing that they benefit the grazier because it helped keep the kangaroo populations down. They otherwise have to go and get a damage mitigation permit to shoot them all. Okay, next slide. Fencing. Wildlife safe fencing is well established. It's very well known. Of course, it's expensive, but it could be prioritised areas where there's known movements of vulnerable animals. Next slide, please. Water points can be turned off when the paddock is rested and no stocks are present. And plus, you could leave areas of the property open, closed to water points to preserve what's now called water remote habitat. Next slide, please. Greenhouse pollution is a bit more difficult, but Meat and Livestock Australia have committed to carbon neutrality by 2030. Good on them. I don't know how they'll do it, but good on them. Next slide. So just a final slide here. There are alternative revenue streams, and of course we've had Warren's amazing story of kangaroo grass. Small footprint, high value dryland crops like sandalwood. Kangaroo ranching, which George Wilson is going to be telling us about later, an amazing piece of work. Outback ecotourism, and of course carbon sinks are all other sources of revenue that mean you don't have to necessarily run stock. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mark. Is there any questions from the panel, please?
Well, I personally, I notice that I'm devastated every time I see the totality of what this industry and what our culture has allowed to happen. You said 45 million animals in 1 year?
That's a low estimate.
I just want us to sit with that. 45 million animals in 1 year, dead or harmed because of us wanting to eat beef and lamb.
And that's all the way from geckos, of course. Like every tree has a gecko, all the way up to eagles and books. Yeah.
I've got no questions. I'm just disgusted with my culture.
Appreciate that, Martin. I mean, I'm not a very emotive person, but it's certainly it's quite true. When on the planet we actually just in domesticated animals alone, farm animals, we cull 6 billion, over 6 billion animals just for food, to feed our intake as a population. And you talked about methane and mitigation activities. The question, I guess, getting to the question is, why is this information getting out to people that really need this information, like the general public?
Yeah, it's a really good question, but more importantly, when we've got a set of well-identified mitigations that the industry itself can undertake, and we see they are moving in some areas like carbon neutrality. Again, I don't know how they're going to do it, but good luck, at least thinking about it. But certainly that's, our view is, all of this is avoidable. You don't have to be having this impact. You can still have a viable industry, you can have alternate industries, have a mixed economy. Why do we have to do it this way? Yeah, and certainly talking to industry is something we do as well.
Could I just say, it is unbelievably depressing when I hear the sort of statistics and numbers and all that kind of stuff. Two things. I remember seeing what was it, a documentary, I think, or some news or something about comparing, especially Queensland, with, I think, the situation in Brazil, an unbelievable land clearing goes on in all 4 McDonald's ago.
Yeah.
This place, Queensland, is as bad as that or worse, or as bad as the other states. And then the other thing is that, as you say, why can't this be, why can't it be more well known, especially through the media?
Mm-hmm.
This was put into the media. They wouldn't be allowed to, I suppose, because they're the servants of, corporations, high up or whatever. But yeah, those two things.
Well, I thank you for the question, and the fact is that yes, I'm the one who did the calculation of it that shows that as a percentage of what's left, so the Amazon have a heck of a lot more left than we do, and so even though in absolute area they're clearing more in the Amazon every year, as a percentage of what left, we are clearing more. And so that's the difference, is they absolutely clearing more, but as a percentage of what left, we are clearing more in Queensland, and that's why we got Queensland and New South Wales jointly, because of the weakening of the legislation in both states listed us on the WWF International list of 11 deforestation fronts we're most clearing, and we are the only developed country on that list.
Maybe one of the things we should consider is changing legislation to reflect more so, because in legislation at the moment says land clearing is what's the word they use for improvements.
Yes. Well, I'll let Rebel, she's going to be, Rebel Point will be going through the legislation in quite a bit more detail, so I'll defer to her.
Thank you so much, Mark. Your analysis and research is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Depressing levels. Now, I'm going to sort of interrupt my lovely Earth advocates. I'm hoping to reach a lovely gentleman called Gary, and I'm not sure if he's actually going to be happy to reveal his last name. That's up to him. So before we invite our other speaker who's here, I'm going to try to give Gary a call. We met earlier this year, and he lamented growing up on a farm where his father cared so much about the trees that they themselves were deeply distressed by what other farmers were doing when mechanised land clearing came in and helped everybody escalate it. So if we can reach him, we'll have a quick chat on the phone and we'll just put him on the speaker, and if we can't, that's okay, we'll move on. Today's one of those days where some of the folks we'd like to speak to may or may not actually have technology to reach us, to join us. The same with Charles. We tried 3 times for the internet connection to even get that Zoom call because people are out on land and they're out doing their work. So I'll just see if this works. Won't be a moment. Please hold. Hey, Gary. I'm going to put you on loudspeaker in a minute. There's a couple of dozen people here who'd like to hear your voice. Is that all right? I'm just going to ask you one simple question. Is that all right? Okay, just think for it. Okay, so Gary, we have you on speaker. Can you just say hello to everyone? Can you hear me? Gary, when we met earlier this year, you talked about how sad you and your father were growing up on a small farm holding, watching the rest of the world go a little bit crazy with technology, cutting down trees. We don't have a lot of time today, but as a farmer up in North Queensland there, can you just tell us that story about what you and your father saw and why it made you sad about the trees?
Well, I guess I should say we're sort of, this is a miners' homestead lease, and when my grandfather came here as a miner, you know, and we've got a big history in the mines. What's happened here has been influenced to a large extent by the mining. But anyway, we come here in about 1920, and we're running cattle and pigs and fruit and vegetables, and turning the Brigalow into charcoal actually to be used in the suction gas engines that run the ice plants and the water pumps and so on. So, but unfortunately, the Brigalow scrubs were pushed in the 70s, and that was the biggest impact that we observed, and the clearing went right up to the banks of the creek, and the top banks, and I sort of subsequently discovered that there was at the same time as the 2 chain law that protected 44 yards of the buffer zone on waterways was abolished, and that sort of contributed now to a lot of this alluvial gully erosion, which has gone out onto the reef. And also overstocking from especially maybe from the 50s, and we saw a huge amount of topsoil washing down our creeks, and then of course when all those crops were pushed, there was an enormous amount of runoff, and that contributed to the breakdown of the microclimates and the water infiltration, and that kept the species that were left on the edge of the creeks, kept them alive, and then all sort of dried out and died back and fallen into the creeks and so on. So maybe there's a few quarrels around it, we haven't seen any for that decade or so. But, you know, the dry rainforest that's associated with the Brigalow, dry vines, scrubs, that's probably the biggest loss, you know, as far as the loss of habitat and so on. That's been so heartbreaking.
Gary, I actually just want to thank you very much. I know that you're a busy man and you've got a lot of activities up there where you're trying to protect country. You've written some lovely material for us. We're going to include that in this broader tribunal process. But because we've got you on the phone, we're actually really happy with what you've shared with us. It's devastating and sad, and that's really what we wanted to hear, was a voice from someone who's grown up on the farms up there and how things have changed. So if you had anything to add, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll let you go into your day.
I was going to say that actually, you know, I inherited this place from my dad, and I sort of tried to manage, you know, the integrated agriculture and sort of provide diversity and carbon sequestration and all that. Essentially, I was only about 2 years into that when the Sonoma mine upstream where we draw our water announced that they were going to divert the creek, which they promised to protect because it was because it was considered high value ecological area. And that's what I put the last 7 years into trying to fight that, and of course that is actually now going ahead with the version of that is going ahead and going to mine the coal under within the next month or so. So my devastation is quite extreme, and I hope we are able to watch it and to sort of campaign for stronger regulation that can stop that sort of thing and making the processes and totally unsustainable creek versions, you know.
Yeah. Gary, I think all of us are feeling your loss, and there's a lot of very sad people in the room at the moment, and I guess we'd just like to extend a big virtual hug and love, and we'll stay in touch and we'll offer as much support as we can as you continue to monitor Coral Creek and all the damage that's been done. But lots of love and hugs from people who really care about the planet. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Gary. I think one of the problems is the connections between me and folks with emails have died because my laptop died. It's been a weird sort of day. So I'll put James on to see if he can help you get onto the live stream going. So I'm just going to let everyone say a big clap. It's like, thank you. So I think after Martin's facts and figures and then hearing Gary, it's a bit sad. So I don't think the news is any better with our next speaker, but I'll hand back to Maggie. And just remember, we are solutions focused. We know that this stuff is devastating, but the sad thing is not enough people know, as Auntie Mary has pointed out. But yeah, over to you, Maggie. Thank you. Oh, somebody, anyone can read. Thank you, Isaac. Sorry, no.
No problem. Actually, great. Can we please call Scott Wallace? Scott, before we start, perhaps we can just ask your name and where you're from and your work.
Sure. My name is Scott Wallace. I'm a scientist, educator, law student and animal rights activist, and I'm a Bachelor of Science with honours, majoring in marine ecology, and I'm about to start my thesis in a few months on Earth jurisprudence and some of the rights of nature, emerging ecological theories as well.
Thanks, Scott. So can we ask you to talk to us about the impact of industrial scale agricultural practices on livestock?
Sure. I'd just like to thank the Tribunal for the opportunity to represent the non-human members of the Earth community. non-human animals and other members of the Earth community here today. It's an absolute privilege and something that I do not take lightly. As we are all here today, we're representing the communities, the environment and the animals and the effects that our choices and consequences, laws and policies are having on them. And so I take today with great honour. I'd just like to before I continue, thank Martin Taylor for such a thorough, necessary and relieving analysis on the environmental impacts of the animal agriculture industry. I've experienced the suppression of information myself over the years as an independent researcher, and the animal agriculture industry is an ecological disaster, nothing less. So framing my analysis today, I'd like to start by talking about how human-centered culture and anthropocentric ideologies that have underpinned our society and our economic systems. But we've seen humans as separate from nature, as superior to nature, and as a result of this deep-rooted human-centeredness, we've seen animals as property, where sentient life forms are considered to be mere objects and not a community of subjects, as articulated by people like Thomas Berry. And so as a result of this property status of animals, the legal protections afforded to animals has reflected this. And so what we have, we've seen a welfarist approach in terms of the governing our relationship with animals. So there's a big difference between animal rights and animal welfare. The animal welfare legislation, which is the dominant paradigm within our policies and legislation. So here I've got the Animal Care and Protection Act, and this is based off that welfarist paradigm where animals are afforded various protections in terms of, free to be to exhibit natural behaviours, claim to be free from. Just get these right. So it's based off the 5 freedoms, the 5 Fs, and so this is the freedom from hunger and thirst, discomfort, pain, injury and disease, freedom to express normal behaviours, and freedom from fear and distress. Most notably and arguably the most important right that animals are not granted is a right to life under our current systems. And so from an animal rights perspective, this is something that we would argue is the most imperative right that should be granted to any member of the Earth community, human or non-human alike. So from this welfarist approach, I'd just like to bring the Tribunal's attention to the Animal Care and Protection Act, and I encourage you all to examine this. Section 3 is purposes of the Act, and it states the purposes of this Act are to do the following: promote the responsible care and use of animals. So our primary legislation in order to protect animals promotes the use of animals. So therefore we have a structure which enables the exploitation of animals to continue. And so the majority of our exploitation of animals is in the animal agriculture sector. And although I haven't found the specific numbers for the Brigalow Belt area, I'd like to discuss some of the more general facts and figures around the treatment use of non-human animals here. And so the Act does claim to protect animals from unjustifiable, unnecessary or unreasonable pain, and there are a number of offence provisions where you cannot be cruel to animals, and there's offences for a breach of duty. However, the law we have in place is relatively speciesist, where depending on your membership to a particular species, you're afforded more protection than other animals. Unfortunately, livestock animals are afforded the least amount of protection in terms of our legislation and policy, whereas companion animals, which is what this Act really serves to protect, are afforded the highest level of protections. Interestingly, one thing that is not questioned is our consumption of animal products, and is it necessary? But this Act does serve to balance the interests of humans and those industries that are dependent on the use of animals with the interests of animals themselves. And so there was, within our legislation, what we have is a number of exceptions. So it says there is an exemption for all these cruelty provisions if an industry code of practice is followed. And so for almost every industry that revolves around the use and exploitation of animals, there is an industry code of practice set up where it can be created to support that industry. Of course, the animal agriculture sector and livestock sector does have their own codes of practice in place. Now, very few of these actually compulsory requirements. Some of these codes, such as the cattle code, are voluntary. The pig farming code, and I like to refer to as pig not pork because we like to use euphemisms to describe things that we may not necessarily feel comfortable about discussing. That code has some compulsory components, whereas the majority of it is voluntary. So we essentially have a law which seems quite strong, however, looking into the details, it allows immense amounts of suffering and harm to be inflicted on animals that, as members of the public and community, we would expect to not be happening to animals. And this was something that really concerned me, which I started exploring law and the industry. In Australia, so straight off the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in 3 months in Australia, between March to June, we slaughtered 170 million animals. This is 100 at least, okay? This is 170 million lives lost from sentient creatures who do not want to die. So in addition to the insane effects on wildlife from livestock and the clearing that we've seen, in addition to that 30, 40 odd million, there is millions of animals that are being slaughtered each year. Globally, we're talking almost 60 billion land animals each year and the 2.5, 2.6 trillion fishes. These creatures are sentient and capable of, experiencing a range of things we do as humans. So getting to some of the specifics of the livestock sector on animals. For example, there are provisions within the Animal Care and Protection Act which highlight that it is an offence to, say, cut the tail off a dog unless there's proper veterinary care, and this can attract fines of up to $12,000. The same practices are completely legalised and supported within the animal agriculture sector. So we have a differentiation between some animals being more valuable and more morally important compared to others. And so I'd like to take this opportunity today to continue to be a voice for all members of the Earth community and get us questioning as a society, as a culture, and as questioning our governance systems. Do we want to continue with the use and exploitation of animals as a potential solution to this? We are experiencing the rise and increase of industries that are no longer revolving around the use and exploitation of animals. So in addition to Martin's solutions, I would advocate that the use of animals, and what we're seeing here, for example, in the dairy industry, male calves are taken from the mothers, often within hours of birth. They've been left to die from starvation or dehydration. They're sold by weight of a veal. The females are impregnated 4 to 5 times over and over. This is a very brutal cycle. It's something that has become normalised within our society and is an industry that I used to support as a consumer. There's documentaries such as Dominion, which have been released in the last year, which I'll urge you all to explore, and members of the Tribunal to consider the institutionalised and normalised suffering of animals within our society. The United Nations back in 2010 has been advocating for an urgent global shift towards a plant-based diet to address the worst impacts of climate change and a whole number of environmental harms. And so there was an article that Martin brought up which was focusing on, it said something leaves the consumers as the only driver of change. I totally agree with this, although it's not only the grassroots momentum that leads to shifts in our world. It does take policy shifts, legislation shifts. However, the reason why the Brigalow Belt is being destroyed is because consumers are demanding these products. We need to take responsibility for the destruction that is happening out there as a result of our choices, which are not a personal choice if there is a victim involved. So the use of animals is something that does need to be questioned. And looking back in terms of how the Indigenous mob were interacting with non-human animals, completely different to the way we are operating now. Hunting and killing animals is out of necessity, out of survival. We are no longer in a society where this needs to continue, and so questions must be asked about our role and contributions to unnecessary suffering. At the moment, the best reasons we have of farming livestock is because we like to consume the animal flesh. It's cultural justification, it's convenience justification, it's out of pleasure. And so today, I'd just like to get the Tribunal and members of the community to consider if we think it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals, then we must understand that perhaps culture, convenience, taste and pleasure are not good enough excuses. We do have the power to change the world and influence the direction of our growth and our consciousness, and keeping animals off our plates and off our shoes and off our couches, I think is a very important step forward in terms of creating a world where it's ecologically just, it's just for humans, but it's also just for all members of the Earth community. Is that time? Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Is there any questions from the panel, please?
I have a quick one. Thank you, Scott. That was a really excellent overview of these big picture issues around these industries. Do you feel personally encouraged by what I personally see as a really rapid rise in veganism and responses to very thoughtful eating and thinking about what we're doing?
Totally. I've experienced the inner transformation of culture myself. I'm looking at the stats across the globe. Veganism is the largest growing social justice movement, and so people are moving away from consuming animal products, and it's the vegan philosophy I really think ties in well with the principles of Earth jurisprudence, where we are looking at an ecocentric point of view, and the numbers of vegans are increasing, and this is going to be minimising the impacts on the animals and really minimising the ecological effects. And so that's a really bottom-up approach to challenging some of these issues, but it does take us going through challenging our cultural conditioning, challenging our society in some ways and going against the status quo. And I feel that this, as long as industries want to seek a path of least resistance, metaphorically and literally, in terms of the animal agriculture sector, and the way we've been educated and brought up allows these industries to continue, because we are disconnected from the consequences of our choices.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Scott. I want to apologise to the 54 billion animals that I've got on a $6 billion list, 6 billion animal list. You're right, it's just over 60.2 billion animals. That's correct. So, but in saying that, as you can see, I'm not a vegan as yet, but I'm happy to be convinced of that, and certainly my partner's doing that. And we see it often out where we live, a Volvo that has vegan on written all over the side of it, as part of the locations. So it's convincing, it's starting to be convincing. Are there other techniques that you believe can be used to change your attitudes and behaviours?
I think it is about reconnecting, however that may be, to our core values of justice, compassion, and respect. People hold these beliefs as human beings. However, actions have been out of alignment with that. So I think going through, however that may be, that process of self-evaluation, introspection, and really looking at us as individuals and the contributions we make to society can really help people move in that direction. And I think your mob back in the day were vegans, and here's my point. It's about minimising and avoiding animal products where practical and possible. And so, it was out of necessity that your mob were out killing kangaroos, emus, whatever they may be. Another process could be looking through our conditioning of kindness, and when we're conditioned to eat certain animals and see particular animals as more important. I would encourage everyone, just as the Indigenous people of Australia, the nation now known as Australia, had totems. Why don't we extend our totems to all Earth members? There's nothing stopping us from extending that respect to all animals.
Yeah, have a totem, I'd say. Have 2 or 3.
Many, millions, bro. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, sorry. No, Mary's got a question. Well, just a comment. I agree with everything you're saying, but I sort of have a difficulty with only looking at the right to life of animals and so on. I can't help thinking on a broader global scale of human societies where there's no other societies that are humans, especially the ones that are, always being invaded and bombed, like in the United right for life in the Philippines and various other countries. Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to say that, and I know that's a bigger problem because it's to do with states, you know, there's more, you know, because they are in charge, of course, on behalf of plutocracies, basically, the state everywhere, you know. And while they're working wonderful, and it's quite right, the movement of all sorts that we've heard, most of the day now, in trying to turn this around environmentally, ecologically, and so on. And it's very, it's good, it's right, but in the old days, our old days, it was sort of like you look after the land, and that becomes a template for the kind of society we have. So it's a relationship. But now, I think that thing is reversed, actually. That you have to look at what the modern sort of system is, which is pretty utterly uncivilized, actually. Where the state is in charge, they are an enabler of the equation, the state. So you have to target them, and then sort of, I'm not saying in a linear way, and then look at this very broad, universal kind of thing we're looking after.
Yeah.
I'm not saying put looking after that in second or anything, I'm not saying that at all. I certainly wouldn't, you know. But I don't know why we can't go over something like, you know, stop making war. You know, I know that, you know, we all know there's been huge international protests of millions of people, and the state just simply ignored that. And the state just ignores whatever people say, no matter how well-meaning and strong, about anything to do with the environment. So I'm just thinking that it might be. Oh, well, I don't know.
I've shared your sentiments, and I understand, you know, where do we focus our efforts and how do we minimise suffering and injustice for everyone on the planet. A few things that I pick up on. So I think one of the reasons why we continue to treat humans with so much disregard and violence, not us as individuals, but as a general society, is because we are killing and slaughtering billions and billions and billions of animals in the same systems that we used to put you know, people into concentration camps. And so there's very clear links there. The philosophy of veganism is to promote non-violence towards oneself, towards other people, towards animals. And when we do have enough grain and food being grown around the world to feed people, but it's given to livestock, then we can also tackle human rights issues and poverty through redistribution of these resources. We don't have a blueprint to how we do tackle and address these environmental issues, human rights issues, so it's about doing what we can with what we know to move forward and to continue our evolution. And so I think these issues need to be tackled concurrently, and the animal rights issues can really be addressed every day with the 3 meals we make and when we go to purchase some shoes, choosing to not have cow skin on them. It's very simple as that. So I think massive efforts to address human rights issues and that side of justice, but this is something that I feel can be addressed very quickly if people are willing to go within and to put less reliance on governments to change the world. We all have been able to influence and change the direction of our society, and so we can do that together. Thank you.
Can we please call Rebel Pointon? Hello, Rebel. If you wouldn't mind, please telling us your name and perhaps where you're from and your qualifications.
Sure. I'm Rebel Pointon. I'm the Senior Law Reform Solicitor with the Environmental Defenders Office Queensland, which is a community legal centre that works within the Western legal system to try and improve it so it can better protect our environment and communities.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebel. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you if you could please tell us how our current laws support the decimation of biodiversity through agriculture, and also maybe recommend some further law reform that might be suitable.
Sure. I'd firstly like to recognise and pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and the land we'll be discussing today, and the First Peoples here today. And also to thank the Untitled Chapter people for the beautiful welcome they gave us this morning. And thank you for allowing me to present to you today, Tribunal. So I'm giving a snapshot of the laws that regulate the Brigalow Belt clearing, and has suggested some recommendations at the end. So there are federal, state and local laws that regulate clearing that may be involved. It really depends on the type of activity the clearing is undertaken for, the scale of the clearing, any other species that might be in that area that have habitat in the area, and also registration of cultural heritage or native title. I am not a specialist in native title whatsoever, or necessarily cultural heritage matters, but it is a factor in clearing that I'll briefly touch on today. Next slide, please. So under federal laws, the federal law that regulates any clearing is the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, under which the Brigalow communities are listed as threatened, endangered ecological communities. Any activity that might be considered to have a significant impact on those communities must be referred for assessment under the Act. If the area has been cleared within the last 15 years, it's generally not considered to be a good enough condition to warrant being protected under that Act. And it's the same actually under our Queensland tree clearing laws. No recovery plan applies to this species. Normally a recovery plan is prepared for species to guide decision making under it and to help determine when its impact might be significant. It is quite a general term, so they do need species-specific plans for helping decision makers and proponents of activities to understand whether their activity might be caught under the legislation. And it's really reliant on the person proposing the activity to actually refer the activity to the federal government. As mentioned by Martin Taylor earlier, the federal government isn't proactively enforcing this legislation at all that we've seen. Under Queensland laws, we have a range of different laws that may apply that I'll go through today. They've just listed there. The applicable law or the state level really depends on, as I said, where clearing is being undertaken and the purpose of the clearing. So the first is the Vegetation Management Act. This is the main act that regulates agricultural related clearing, and as you've heard already today, agricultural practices are the main reason the Brigalow Belt has been cleared. Under that Act, the 16 regional ecosystems that form the Brigalow ecological communities in Queensland are listed as endangered because they have less than 10% of the pre-clearing extent still remaining. So under this Act, tree clearing can be considered legal where it is exempt. In 2013, we had as Martin alluded to, a weakening of this Act in such a way that high-value regrowth on freehold land, which would have normally been regulated under the Act, was actually deregulated, and those areas became what's called Category X, so they're exempt from regulation under this Act. And that was a large area of Queensland, and those areas were then actually locked up in property maps and accessible vegetation, which a landholder can essentially apply to have their area scrutinised with a bit more detail as to what vegetation is there. And then once that area has been certified by the department, it's then given a property map of accessible vegetation, which locks in the regulation. So at the time, these areas are deregulated and they remain so today unless the property holder has actually voluntarily sought to re-regulate those areas. The accepted development codes were also introduced around this time period when the laws were weakened, and I'll go into those in a moment. Tree clearing can also occur where you do actually have a development permit. In some instances that's necessary. There was a development permit under the period between 2012 and 2015 for high-value agriculture, actually until this year. But this has since been taken away. And, oops, sorry, one back there. And also, if there are other approvals needed, then they need to be obtained as well. Thanks. So the accepted development codes mean that you don't actually need your clearing that you're proposing to do assessed. You just need to notify the department that you intend to do it. And a code has to apply to that type of clearing in that area. And they're very broadly drafted codes, and also for various broad reasons. So fodder harvesting is one, necessary environmental clearing, which is quite broadly framed, And these codes can even apply to endangered communities. So the Brigalow Belt has been subject to a lot of clearing under these codes. And this, oh sorry, yep. Thanks. This is actually from Martin Taylor's fantastic work, a report he's published in recent years. And I'm sorry, you can't actually, I can't see that, I'm not sure if you can. But it demonstrates clearing under one of these codes for thinning, which the code for that practice has, one of the codes has disappeared. Thinning is still allowed under these laws through other codes, but it's quite extensive clearing, up to I believe 70% of an area could have been cleared under these thinning codes without actual assessments prior to the clearing of whether it was a sustainable thing to do or an appropriate activity. As Martin Taylor mentioned, we have had a lot of regulatory instability in this area. It's highly politicised. And I've mentioned the weakening of the laws. We also had that period of government actually stop enforcing our vegetation tree clearing laws, and in some ways assisting landholders to clear the land. In 2018, this year, we actually did see the government seek to reintroduce some of the laws that were taken away over that period, but not all of them. As I mentioned, the deregulation of many areas is still in existence. Codes still exist, and the accepted development codes, but they are being reviewed at present. And there's no limits on clearing, and there are other laws that can get around this, even when they're regulated under this code, under this legislation. You can use other laws to still allow quite widespread clearing. And obviously, every time we have a legislative change, we see a lot of panic clearing around that, which has been putting up the amounts of clearing enormously as well. Thanks. The Nature Conservation Act actually protects all native plants and animals in Queensland. However, the extent of protection they're given really varies. The Brigalow communities are listed as least concern under this Act, which actually means they're not really given much protection at all. No flora surveys needed before clearing. But there might be wildlife in the Brigalow area that is actually needing to be considered before clearing, and a wildlife spotter catcher may be necessary. This isn't a very well-enforced Act either, though. And then the Environmental Protection Act might actually apply as well if it's for instance, resource activities like mining and gas. The regulations under the Vegetation Management Act won't apply, and environmental impact assessments will be undertaken for that project under the criteria considered by the Department of Environment. There is a general duty not to harm the environment under this Act, but it's very hard to enforce because it's such a general statement with no criteria behind it as to what that means. But one thing we must be aware of is that assessment of agricultural impacts that are proposed for activities or expansion isn't actually assessed at all under this or any of the other acts. So whether it's actually sustainable to go ahead with the kind of activity that's proposed for these areas isn't assessed under our Queensland or federal laws. And then, as I mentioned, there are protections or recognition at some level around cultural heritage, Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act and the Torres Strait Islander Cultural Heritage Act, and also to some extent the Federal EPBC Act, seek to protect Indigenous cultural heritage that's registered at a Queensland level with the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships, and also non-Indigenous through the Queensland Heritage Act and the Federal EPBC Act through other means. But it really does rely on those departments actually registering them, and in many instances the department's actually enforcing those laws, where many Indigenous groups, for instance, aren't sufficiently resourced to actually use the laws to protect their heritage. And I'm really grateful to be having worked with this year some Indigenous groups who are suffering from having scar trees and really significant trees being cleared for large-scale projects, and I've had a bit more insight into how weak this legislation is and how difficult it is for the Indigenous groups to actually seek to protect their country under these acts. Thanks. So, in a snapshot, a critique that we've pulled from our experiences of these laws is that we really have no overarching conservation plan to help coordinate all of these different laws and to ensure there aren't loopholes that that can continue to allow clearing in these endangered areas. Many exemptions exist. As I said, various acts that can be confusing for the people out there and the community as to know what is expected of the government in regulating clearing in these areas. Cultural and spiritual connection isn't meaningfully recognised across the laws, nor traditional owners meaningfully empowered to protect their country. The federal laws, as we've said, are poorly enforced, as well as some state laws, and as I mentioned, no real assessment of suitability of this land for Western agricultural practices. Thanks. So some of the recommendations we have that probably work with the current laws and could be developed quite easily are developing a species recovery plan, having a clear law without exceptions or conflicting laws that don't apply differently to different development proposals or activities. Simply relying on the fact that this is an endangered community that needs this kind of action, for instance, not clearing it anymore, to recover, and ensuring that it actually is perpetuated through our laws. And that means educating the people out there who are having to work under these laws and enforcing those laws so that the law is respected. We need meaningful recognition and protection of cultural and spiritual connection to trees in your areas. More protected areas generally would be fantastic. And incentivise restoration activities as well. And we do see the Queensland Government actually has a project, the Land Restoration Fund, which they're, I understand, seeking to maybe build carbon credits kind of programs into the Queensland framework with biodiversity co-benefits associated as well, which is an exciting place to watch. But if we really want real change, something that we need to talk about more, and I commend Ayla for really driving is that we need meaningful recognition under all of our laws, federal, state, local, our entire legal system, that our earth and its ecosystems and species have an inherent right to exist and thrive, that humans, we are all a part of our earth and inextricably connected to and dependent on it, and we have a duty to live within the limits of our planet to ensure humans and all of the other species on our planet can thrive with health and balance. So thank you so much for your time and hearing from me today, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Rebel. Is there any questions from the panel, please?
Yes, please. Thank you, Rebel. I understand this is a really complex area of fragmented and conflicting laws. I only have a couple of questions, but they're kind of interlinked. That's really just to clarify, particularly for the non-lawyers in the room who might have found some of that kind of odd, that certain things are protected but nothing's protected, certain things are enforced but nothing's enforced. So I mean, really, it's fair to say then that these laws don't actually proactively set out any kind of master plan or understanding of the broader ecosystem spaces across Australia, because there doesn't seem to be any kind of blanket laws protecting the living world. And obviously from an earth jurisprudence point of view, or an earth laws point of view, we're always saying that current environmental laws seem to chip away around the edges of a pro-growth paradigm. And to me, I mean, my question is, do you feel that this constant disruption in the land clearing laws is literally driven by these economic forces saying, we'll try to protect a bit, well actually no, there's a change of government, let's protect nothing, but hang on, we'll try to protect a bit. So do you feel that at the end of the day, all this conflict and fragmentation is because we're actually trying to juggle economic interests first?
Definitely, I would agree with that. I think also the fact that, as they mentioned here today and in previous days as part of the Layla Symposium, I think one of the driving forces behind it is this concept we have of individualised property rights that are leading people to believe that they can do whatever they like to their land because they own the land, even if they weren't the traditional owners and they might have actually stolen that land. They now have a concept that they own that land and it has no connection to the rest of the communities around it, ecological and social communities around it. And so I would say, of course, as we heard from the other speakers earlier, there are huge commercial imperatives around our agricultural systems to try to get more grazing, especially because I understand Australia has a clean kind of image, you know, to the world with our beef industry, which is obviously not true, as we're hearing, in the damage we're doing to our country through these clearing laws. But just I guess this, the very basis of our understanding of property rights really, I think, is leading a lot of this belief that we shouldn't be regulating people's activities and they have the right to clear whatever they like on the land that they think they own.
And that's definitely was linked to one of my next observations, is the culture shift that's required. Really, we need the kind of white fella society to be really looking at not only what we eat and how we eat, but what we're doing to the country, and really rearrange what we expect. I guess my final question might be hopefully on a slightly more positive angle. So from what I can hear, when the Newman government came in and they stripped back all the vegetation clearing laws, there seemed to be this wide open veg clearing party, and everyone went a little crazy. But the point is, if you turn that back around, before that, there was a whole bunch of land that wasn't being cleared. So some of those laws were in fact working, weren't they?
Oh, definitely. As the graph that Taylor had up showed, the clearing rates really reduced under the first iteration of the Vegetation Management Act, and then the amendments in 2009 that sought to really get rid of broad-scale clearing. We saw massive reductions, and then once again, once the laws were weakened, massive increases that we're still feeling today from those laws. So
that's the good news.
Yeah, we can actually do this. We can regulate it.
Constraints on our greedy, crazy behaviours, and I think that's a really important lesson. And we're just seeing the devastation across Queensland now, the legacy of that pulling back the laws. But that's all the questions I have. Other folks have any questions?
Still one question. Normally, one of the things that really grates on me is a lot of the property owners, per se, are actually leaseholders. Who lease the land. If I was to lease a house, like a rental, I have certain obligations. You can't wreck it, and that's the kind of stuff. Can't put holes in walls and bits and pieces. How do you believe we should be actually changing the way leases operate so that it actually reduces the impact on riparian areas and other critical areas around biodiversity spots? And not only just in saying that, but also across the total landscape from desert through to ocean.
Excellent question, thank you, Ross. Something that is recommended a lot is around just that point that we have leasehold arrangements where the lessees are obliged to take care to some extent of the country that they've leased, but they're not enforced at all. But that is a power that our government, Queensland government, definitely has, is to require that these the people holding those leases actually report back and demonstrate that they are being responsible landholders that are ensuring the survival of that land and its health for future generations to come. So I think that's an excellent recommendation that can be used, that's within the government's power to remind landholders that they are actually, I mean, all landholders, even if they're not holding a lease, obviously, but it is legally a power that they do have under our current laws that they could require landholders to meet a higher duty expected of them and across all the areas that you mentioned.
Because we are landlords, all of us here in the room, and there's an expectation that we have, and I think that should be put to task in terms of change legislation because of the non-compliance. And I find it ironic that in a lot of government departments, when they put through new legislation, it's like in America, where if you say you put through new legislation, go and buy extra guns, for instance, it's the same thing with land clearing. There's a behaviour pattern, but the compliance issue I have major issues with, and that's departments shrinking compliance officers to meet an increased obligation. So I think that's one of the things that probably needs to be addressed.
Excellent points, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you so much.
And finally, for this case, could we please call invite our last speaker, Professor George Wilson. Afternoon, Professor. Could you please tell us your name, where you're from, and your qualifications?
Okay, I'm a veterinarian and a population ecologist with a PhD from the University of Aberdeen, veterinary degrees from the University of Sydney. I've worked with the National Parks and Wildlife and Environment departments at both state and federal level and the Department of Agriculture in Canberra. And I'm currently a honorary professor in the Fenner School of Environment and Society, the same school that Charlie Nassar was addressing us from earlier today.
Fantastic, thank you, Professor. So if I may, can we please ask you about some alternatives to current industrial agricultural practices?
Yeah, well, I'd like to take you through some overheads here that describe the option of making greater use of kangaroos as meat producers. Now, this may not be, should I say, the flavour of the month with the number of people in the room, but we'll see how we go. Thank you. Yeah, so I'd like to talk about positive alternatives. And I'll take you through the state of our agricultural ecosystems, both in the Brigalow area and immediately to the west, in fact the same area that Warren was talking about, the Mulga lands. I'll talk about the general benefits of kangaroos and what might be done to increase their value and enhance sustainability of their harvests. Thanks. Now, where are we coming from this? Well, if you look at our national reserve system, about 8.5% of it's in state parks and national parks and state parks, about 8% of it's Indigenous community land, and only about 1% is in private conservation reserves. Next one, thanks. And that's a reflection of the fact that if this figure shows gross primary production in terms of carbon, and the big blue area is really land that's got very low soil carbon and carbon in it, very low productivity land. Next one. And that shows you where the national parks and reserves are, the IPAs in particular, Indigenous Protected Areas, so that it emphasises the fact that so much of our reserves aren't in those most productive lands. Next one. So the prime habitat is not adequately protected either in reserves or indeed outside of them. Only 1% of the agricultural land that is in production has got some form of conservation covenant over it. And there's also very ineffective species management, and a few quotes here. Australia, half the world's mammal extinctions in the last 200 years. And then from David Lindemeyer, one of my colleagues, most losses have been on private lands. And then, as a result of a major piece of work by John Winowski recently, the mammal status of Australia's animals is worsened. Next. So it's in this context that agriculture and the rangelands in particular have been drastically altered to increase productivity, and we've been hearing about that. Next. And in this current situation, the objective is to produce more meat and wool, and this is a national priority, to grow more grass, and that's where the tree clearing comes from, to put in more water, more pipes and troughs so that the animals can eat that grass, and then turning particularly to the area that is under discussion now, to increase lambing percentages, and that means eliminating wild dogs. Next. Another thing is underway in these areas, and that's the erection of cluster fences around groups of properties. And this is the area that Warren was talking about. Extensive erection of a fence like the one that you can only just see there. It's a 2-metre high netting fence with barbed wire on the top of it. Next. And the objective of this, as I've said, is to increase the number of preferred species, and they're cattle, sheep and goats. And the goats are in transition from being feral to becoming domesticated. And in that brown area at the top, which is the area that I'm talking about, the rangelands of Australia, there are some 7.5 million cattle. That says 37 million sheep and 3 million goats. Next. And these animals have got substantial capital value. At $800 a head, those cattle are worth about $6 billion. The sheep are worth about 3.7. And the 3 million goats, $70 a head, are worth about 230 million. Next. I'll come back to that and talk about that in the context of kangaroos. But before I do, these changes and the advent of agricultural productivity has had substantial effect on a wide range of other species. We've heard about its impact on koalas, impacted dramatically on bilbies, burrowing bedhogs, wombats, and bridle nail-tailed wallabies. These are all highly threatened species that are now confined largely to small areas. Koalas remain quite widely distributed, but the other 4 are really only found behind fences that protect them from cats and foxes. Next. Back to kangaroos. Here you see that what's happened to kangaroo populations since 1981 on the left through to recently, and all the numbers have disappeared from that figure for some reason. But it does show you the sorts of fluctuations that we get. And each of those peaks and then the subsequent troughs have taken place during droughts. And the final one there at the end is an anticipated decline that's occurring because of the drought at the moment. Next, hopefully this will work. Yeah. So the harvest quota of the kangaroos fluctuating there at the top is 15% of the population for grey kangaroos, 20% for red kangaroos. The bottom line with the arrow is the actual harvest, and it'll show you that there's absolutely no relationship between the commercial kangaroo harvest that's actually taking place, or indeed the quotas, which are the line above it, and the fluctuations that are taking place. Next, thanks. And of course, these fluctuations that I described there with the decline in kangaroos are animals dying of drought, basically. So the question is, should kangaroos continue to be pests? Should there be such a very low harvest there? Are current trends acceptable? And I'd like to talk you through the fact that there's a very low demand at the moment for kangaroo products. There's a very large wastage due to pest control shooting. Millions of kangaroos are starving and lots of them are being killed on roads. Or should we convert them to assets, manage those populations and possibly even reduce livestock numbers? So the alternative is not to waste this resource, to raise the value of kangaroos, market their adaptations and attributes. It's a very healthy meat. They're very efficient producers of meat. They have low carbon emissions and low water requirements, and they bone out. They convert to a much higher percentage of meat than livestock. Next. I'll just take you through those again. So, kangaroos clearly are uniquely Australian if you're looking to market something. The meat's very high in protein, low fat and cholesterol, high in essential things such as iron and omega fatty acids. The leather is the finest and the strongest for weight of any leather, and they have a low impact on the Australian environment. Next. If you look at the conversion of meat, if these are DSEs are dry sheep equivalent. A steer on the right has the 12 DSE and a kangaroo has about half. So therefore 24 kangaroos eat the same as one steer. And those 24 kangaroos have produced 288 kilograms of usable meat. They actually produce a bit more than that, but that's just to be a bit conservative, we put it like that. Quite a lot compared to 240 from the steer on the right. Next, thanks. As I've mentioned, there's a very high boning out percentage, 60% there, and then the next one. They've also have a very, they have lower carbon emissions. Now, if you take this through to just how much carbon is produced for each kilogram of meat, you come up with some very advantageous figures. 1 kilogram of kangaroo meat yields 0.75 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. Whereas beef, 1 kilogram of beef, is more than 30 times as much. They've also got very low water requirements. A dry beef cow consumes 80 litres of water per day. That's 300 litres of water for every kilogram of beef. Whereas a kangaroo will get by on 1.5 litres of water per day, or 91 litres for every kilogram of meat. There are considerable water savings from getting your meat from kangaroos. Next one. Landscape conservation. Oops, yep. They have low physical impact on the environment. They've got padded feet, soft soils, and their feet are soft on soils and riparian areas. People say to me, well, what's your evidence for that? And this is a photograph taken just a few hundred metres from our home in Canberra. And you can see there's about 50 or 60 kangaroos on the golf course there. Now, there's no way the golf course would tolerate one cow or any sheep. So you really don't need much more evidence than that. Yes. And contrary to general perceptions, the way kangaroos are harvested is in fact very animal friendly. Field shooting and headshots might be ugly, but they're instantaneous and there's no transport of live animals to slaughter. The meat's therefore stress-free and the industry has less infrastructure. So a lot of those things that take place in the abattoirs are actually taking place in the field. That means there's less energy use. Next one. So those kangaroos that we've talked about, and I'm lamenting the fact that they're not worth more money, that says 60 cents a kilo there in red, means that the 40 million kangaroos in Australia are currently worth about $550 million. Meanwhile, the 3 million goats are worth, at $70 a head, are worth 230 million. Now, if we could get kangaroos to be as valuable as wild goats, next one, then suddenly those wild kangaroos are worth $2.8 billion. Thank you. It's time, in my view, to redefine competition and kangaroo status, integrate kangaroos into production, enable the benefit to landholders, create a stronger kangaroo industry. Let's try and reverse that trend and remove some of the pressure that it's currently under. And this pressure and disdain for the kangaroo industry comes from rather strange bedfellows, both the animal rights community and also conservative graziers. Kangaroos don't compete with the existing livestock industries. They could become an asset, just like feral goats in recent years, or even wild deer, which are worth 2 times as much. Next one. So how do we increase the value? Well, we'll try regional branding, improve the quality, emphasise the fact that they're wild and come from a natural native diet, that the meat is not farmed, and that that their method of killing is actually humane. Next, please. Develop marketing alliances with the likes of World Wildlife Fund, Landcare, RSPCA, and indeed Meat and Livestock Australia. Next one, if we could only get them on side. It might be possible to actually increase the size of the kangaroo population, and this is some modelling work we've done that shows that red kangaroos would actually survive very nicely in the northern part of Queensland, where their numbers are currently very low. Australia currently exports more than 3,000 tonnes of kangaroo meat annually, and there is access to 60 countries across the world. I think we could do a lot better than that. Next one. Carbon farming. There are opportunities there. We've been told, Martin reminded us that Meat and Livestock Australia wants to be carbon neutral by 2030. Like Martin, I've got no idea how they're going to do that, especially noting that cattle methane is 2/3 the greenhouse gas liability of the transport sector. So, there's an option here. Why can't we generate carbon credits by producing low emission meat from kangaroos? And this money could then flow to the landowners, be they Indigenous or non-Indigenous. Next, thanks. Kangaroos will continue to be the national icon. Next. But that doesn't mean kangaroos can't be eaten or used commercially. The photo on the left there is bison in the US, and the bison, of course, are the emblematic animal for the Department of Interior. The French have been known to eat the odd chicken. Next one. Springbok in South Africa have a similar usage. And where I worked in Scotland, the monarch of the Glen, the red deer, is both a Scottish icon and worth money to the landholders on whose properties it occurs. Next one. Use of native species is hardly a novel concept. Next one. Indigenous involvement in these ideas will be very important if we're going to get them off the ground. Next, thanks. So I'd like to appeal to animal preservationists. Are you aware of the unintended consequences of your actions? I'd like to encourage vegetarians, or even vegans for that matter, to become kangatarians. The meat's good for the environment and it's a high quality product. Next, thanks. If you're successful in shutting down the kangaroo industry, pastoralists will continue to regard kangaroos as vermin. Untrained shooting will be more common. There'll be increased animal suffering through starvation and water restrictions. There'll be an adverse impact on Indigenous Australians, a massive wastage of carcasses. There'll be more kangaroo and human car accidents. And most importantly, it diverts scarce conservation resources into alternative control mechanisms. Thanks. I'd like to appeal to graziers. Why not get behind and promote commercial kangaroo use? Ask MLA to get involved and replicate its other promotions. I think the last one's probably a bit of a long bow. I can't see them doing that. But in the meantime, I think they could get involved in improving the value of kangaroos. Next one. Stronger kangaroo industry is not a threat to conventional livestock. 40 million kangaroos are already on your land and you are their stewards. Next, thanks. Stronger kangaroo industry needs innovation and research, champions and coordinated investment. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. Is there any questions from the panel, please?
Yes. Thank you. I'm going to go first, but I'll be very keen to hear Mary and Ross and other questions. But thank you. I have to declare that I am a Kangatarian. I was very keen to hear your talk because my main question is, if we can't be vegan and we want to live in this country sustainably, would having the odd brew for a barbecue now and then enable us to restore our forests and get our quolls and other biodiversity back?
Yeah, it's complicated because quolls and other biodiversity are really have suffered through predators, so we have to address that. But certainly the other thing that's causing them a big problem is the over-clearing and the reduction in shelter. If the quolls and other smaller animals that I showed there had some shrubs under which they could hide the way they used to be able to, then they would do better. And I would suggest that cattle and sheep do a lot more damage and cause problems than kangaroos would, so it's part of the story.
My final sort of comment is, as someone of a European descent in this country, I've always looked around at cattle and sheep and wondered why it was that we had to eat them and let them take over the continent, how insulting it was to the plants and the animals here in this continent that Aboriginal people survived on very healthfully and very sustainably for millennia. So my question to you would be, can you imagine an Australia where we take down the fences and we sustainably harvest wildlife in a caring way again?
There are issues of proprietorship here which are complex, and that's in fact something that we've been trying to think about, is whether those cluster fences could become an asset. I'm very well aware that in Southern Africa and other countries where wildlife's most secure, it's where the landholders have some form of proprietorship, whether they lease animals from the government or the government's still got a role, but it devolves some responsibility to them. So I think if we can make that happen and at the same time ensure that the fences don't become a liability that get in the way of conservation, there are different ways of doing it, yeah. We can manage them at a regional level without fences, and graziers might then attract the animals to their properties and then they have some form of proprietorship. But at the moment where landholders regard them as pests, I think it's a really dangerous situation. You know, if we're still in that situation in 50 years, then I really would fear for the long-term survival of not only kangaroos, but a lot of other wildlife.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have. Mary?
Yes, I have to say that I'm a sort of torn. I'll say that our family, we kangaroos a week probably. It's great, you know. But the only thing I do worry about is I've seen that, you know, the emblems of other countries, that's quite right. But I suppose our idea of looking after the land and you know, all the other life forms and so on would be that they have spiritual value. The spiritual value, the main thing, apart from the totemic reasons and so on, is overproduction, I mean, I know there's kangaroos, but I'm just thinking that the European tradition of being real, individual, very individualistic. Some people might want to go further with this.
You're concerned about over-exploitation.
Over-exploitation,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
But also connected to that is the, chemicals and everything that I've heard of.
Yeah, well, again, that's one of the advantages of kangaroos, which I didn't mention, of course. They thrive without the advent of chemicals or any intervention at all, actually, just leave them alone. That question of over-exploitation, that's why I raised the question of proprietorship. Where you get over-exploitation is like in the marine environment, where fishermen know, well, if I don't go out there and get them, then someone will come around the corner and get them. But where you can establish proprietorship, then someone's got a vested interest in making sure that animals don't get poached, then I think that becomes less of a problem.
That's right, because the original idea would be to make as much money as quickly as possible and so on and so on. You go slower, less, all that stuff. And that's that spiritual.
The whole idea of totemism is a form of ownership, isn't it?
There's also protection as well, Professor. It's about protection as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And having those obligations around those particular species. And Martin's right insofar as a spiritual connection to these animals. It's very difficult to see it from a commercial point of view. But I too, at least eat kangaroo at least once a week.
Very good.
Twice. That's something that's really important for me. Not from a cultural point of view, but also from a health point of view. And I don't necessarily think throwing the baby out afterwards is something, I'm going to be half vegan as well as eating kangaroo. But that's just who I am. But the reality is I too have concerns about the over-commercialisation of kangaroos in terms of where that might lead to.
Yeah, well, there's a strange twist in that, and that was part of what I said, that if the commercial industry is a lot easier to manage than Plan B, which is where animals are shot under damage mitigation permits and the like. And that's why I'm such a strong supporter of the industry, because the kangaroos have to be brought back to a point where where the regulators can ensure they've been shot in the head and they get to count them. Whereas if you shut the kangaroo industry down, then they've got no idea what's going on in the back paddock. We've talked about capacity for regulators to operate here. Queensland's in a huge state, and what goes on in the back paddocks stays in the back paddocks and nobody knows. It's only when you bring them into a point that you can actually regulate it. So I'm really very worried about a lot of the adverse animal welfare things with my veterinary hat on that are going on at the moment in the face of declining kangaroos.
Those large properties around culling of kangaroos and not necessarily doing it in a proper manner,
or humane,
in a cruel manner, in actual fact.
I was on one property recently where 20,000 animals had been shot inside one of those cluster fences. All wasted.
Are there any other questions? I'd still prefer to see a sustainable harvest than to watch them literally dismembered by massive road trains that are carting cattle off to be killed. You've only got to drive around the Brigalow Belt to seriously think that this is an option worth considering in detail. So, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So that concludes all the speakers for our first case today, the impacts of industrial agriculture in the Brigalow Belt. And I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our speakers. We'd like to recommend to this tribunal that they open up the process to invite further public submissions about the impact of industrial agriculture in bioregions across Australia.
Thank you. We will consider that recommendation. And I'd like to thank you, Isaac, for helping to lead all our speakers into the right space. I would also like to apologise that we're running so late. I think we're now half an hour late. We will contact the two people who are going to be zooming in with us for the afternoon session, but because I assumed that we would go a little late because things always change, we'll still be able to, I think if we aim to resume about 10 to 3. So we don't really have a lunch today, we have morning and afternoon tea all over the shop. If we could resume at 10 to 3 for those who would like to join us for our second case study, which is looking at the Darling River and the Gimby Lakes within the context of the Murray-Darling. We'll still be able to wrap up here before 5 o'clock, probably by 4:45. So please feel free to have a break. I believe the coffee shop closest to us will be closed now. You might have to tootle about. Damien, you know where a few places are, but if anyone doesn't know where to go, perhaps you can chat to some other folks in the locals. So thank you so much for your time and patience, everyone. We'll see you back here.